Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our inaugural InvestSense market wrap. What we are trying to achieve every year is to get a market commentator, someone in the industry, to look at the past year, highlight some of the trends, some of the things that have changed, and then take that and look forward and see what we could potentially see, some scenarios or looking into the future. For our first one, we're very fortunate to be hosted by 91. So we're sitting in 91's offices within Cape Town, but also we are joined by Jeremy Gardiner, director at 91. Been here for 33 years, joined in 1992, so lots of experience. So very, very excited to get your views. Jeremy, I don't think we need to tell our audience, or obviously yourself, that 2023 has been quite an up and down year. We started very uncertain around what we were going to see from a change in interest rate policies. Inflation was quite uncertain. There was quite a lot of geopolitical risks. Whereas now we're sitting in a scenario where it does feel a little bit more certain. So towards the end of 2023. So I would like to take a bit of a journey across the globe from a global macro perspective, and then ending on SA. But could we start with the US? I think the US is really the foundation for where a lot of decisions get made. The US has surprised in two ways, I suppose, on the upside this year: growth and inflation. Could you maybe just touch on how that's evolved since the beginning of the year, and then how does that impact the rest of the globe and also South Africa and emerging markets?
You're right. The US has surprised on the upside. And the US is critical. I mean, it's the world's biggest economy. If the US isn't smiling, the rest of the world struggles to smile as well. And interestingly or amazingly, they've actually managed to engineer what is known as a soft landing, which means that they've managed to conquer their inflation without killing the economy. They took interest rates up very aggressively over the last year to 18 months. And it has worked. Their inflation is coming off sustainably. To the point where it actually looks like they're going to be able to bring interest rates down earlier, because we heard for so long higher for longer as inflation was stubborn on the way down. But now it's coming off nicely, and the higher for longer is actually becoming higher for shorter and shorter, to the point where it actually looks like they're going to be able to bring interest rates down at the end of the first quarter as opposed to at the end of the second quarter, which will make us in this part of the world feel a lot better. So economically, they're in good shape. Politically, however, it's going to get noisy. They've got elections in November next year. You conceivably are going to have two octogenarians. I mean, Biden turned 81 last week. Trump it will be 80 when they contest the elections. And then look, there's a silver lining in there somewhere. It says something about the way we're aging, which is why you need a great advisor, because we're going to live a lot longer than people think. The fact that at the age of 81 you can take on one of the world's most stressful jobs is quite unbelievable. And it has massive implications, not just for the Americans, but for the planet. Trump has very different views on climate change, on the war in Ukraine. He could also apparently conceivably pardon himself if elected. So he's got a massive incentive to win.
Quite interesting about the age comment. I hope I'm not peaking in my career at 80 and 81. I hope I said a bit sooner than that, but that's a very good point. If we move away from America, shifting to Europe again at the beginning of the year was facing, you had the Ukraine-Russia war, there were gas price increases, electricity increases. We went through their winter where there was a lot of scaremongering around the coldest winter. People are going to, sort of freeze to death per se, but again they've managed to navigate through that. I mean, what are some of the things they did? How did they get through that?
Amazingly, this time last year they actually thought they were going to have load shedding. In fact, apparently there's a European delegation here learning from Eskom how to actually manage something like that. They came through it. They didn't have the economic collapse. They were just worried because Vladimir was turning off the taps. They managed to get through winter, and they've come back quite nicely. They're going to have what's known as a softish landing. So they've managed, it looks like, to start to bring their inflation down sustainably, but it's had more of a hit on their growth than it has on the Americans. So they're at 23-year highs at the moment. They're probably also going to start coming down at the end of the first quarter. So Europe looking okay, just slightly weaker than the Americans though on the growth side, but should also escape a recession.
Okay. And the UK? The UK is interesting for
UK
me.
of the three, is probably the weakest from a growth perspective. Their inflation has halved. You've heard Rishi Sunak congratulating himself and the Tories for that, but it's still more than double where the Bank of England would like it. They are probably going to have to stay higher for longer than the Europeans and the Americans, and they still face the chance of a mild recession sometime probably second, third quarter of next year. But they've got lots of problems. I mean, they've got strike activity at over 30-year highs. That takes us back to the days of Margaret Thatcher in the late 80s. And also, interestingly, a lot of polls coming back now saying more Brits believe that it was a mistake to leave the European Union rather than a good thing. So they're going to struggle a bit more next year. Also in the property market, I mean, people could borrow at less than 1%. Now they're paying 6%. So the property market's struggling. It's going to be tough probably for at least another 6 months for them.
Yeah, interesting with they had 3 prime ministers within
Correct. I think that was last year. In a 12-month period, 3 prime ministers, so 4 finance ministers.
Politically and inflation and interest rate wise, it's far more like an emerging market.
They've had a tough time.
In a developed world, yeah. I think these days you definitely cannot have a global presentation or discussion around global markets without talking about geopolitical risks. There's lots out there, but in your mind, what would be maybe highlight a few of the key ones that you think that have had an impact this year, but also how would they change? What could they do next year to impact the globe in the biggest way, I think?
Look, I mean, the most obvious one at the moment, or the obvious two, what's going on, first of all, the tragic events playing out at the moment in the Middle East. At the moment, markets haven't been too concerned about what's going on there. Markets not anticipating that it's going to accelerate from here. And I think we've all just got to hope and pray that the conflict decelerates from here. Were it to accelerate, were possibly Lebanon to start getting involved, Iran getting involved, the Americans getting involved, then certainly oil would go to $100 per barrel, which means that inflation starts rising across the world, interest rates start rising across the world, and then we'd be looking at a global recession next year. So that is the danger factor that we hopefully want to avoid. In terms of what is going on with Russia, Ukraine, that has been going on a lot longer than anyone expected. It was meant to last a couple of weeks or a month. It's been going on 21, 22 months now. The interest, seemingly with no solution. The interesting thing is that I think that both sides are starting to feel quite depleted. Zelensky's under big pressure from the Western funders, particularly the Americans, saying that they've had enough. I think they've put in $111 billion, and the Republicans are saying enough is enough. That's a big problem for the Europeans, because the Americans fund about 80% of that war, and if they had to pull back, it leaves the Europeans very vulnerable. So Zelensky's under a lot of pressure to strike a deal. On the other side, Putin is encouraged by all of this, but Putin's problem is that the oil price has dropped significantly, down to about $74 per barrel at the moment, and that's how he funds the war. So if it stays at current levels, he's going to struggle to fund it. So I think both sides coming under a bit of pressure to find a solution, and hopefully they eventually do find a solution, because removing that would remove a significant element of risk at the moment going on in the world.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the Chinese haven't decided at this stage to grab Taiwan, because if that happened on top of all of this, it would make things quite difficult.
Yeah, it's a good, I suppose, a good way to move to my next question. I've got a question on China here, but I'll start off with just China and a question mark. Because for me, the Chinese experience from a Westerner's perspective is very interesting. You started off where a while ago they opened up the markets to more Western investors. They became a bit more friendlier to Western investors. The MSCI started including the A shares, mainland China, in a lot of the indices. There was this kind of euphoria, excitement about China, but then you had some regulatory issues or policies that came out and really showed that who is boss in China. So the sentiment has kind of flipped a little bit. Where is it now? Where do you sit from a Chinese perspective and investments, and also politically?
It goes two ways from that perspective, where the investors all sort of flood in, and then they get a fright and they run away, and then they come back a little bit later. But I think certainly one of the things that put China back significantly was their extreme view on COVID, on lockdowns, etc. Then they sort of came out dramatically at the end of last year, and there was a lot of talk about reopening and rebounding this year. That hasn't really materialized. The property market remains under pressure. The municipalities are under pressure. They've got too much debt. So their growth numbers have been scaled down from 6% to about 5% for this year. They're talking 4.2% for next year. The Chinese are stimulating. It looks like it's starting to work. And let's hope that it does work, because we really need the Chinese economy firing, second biggest economy in the world and our biggest trading partner from a South African perspective.
Yeah, that's it. Okay, we've had a quick snapshot of the world. Let's turn our attention to South Africa. The sentiment again towards South Africa has been a bit of a roller coaster, but it does seem to be getting a little bit better. Although we're sitting in Cape Town at the moment, stage 3 of load shedding, there's elections coming up that we're going to get to. It does feel a little bit better. I mean, can you talk about what's your view and 91's view about South Africa at the moment?
Completely. I think South Africans have had a tough time. I mean, it's been tough economic times. We've had sky-high interest rates, inflation coming down too slowly, growth flatlining. But that is what tough economic times are all about. That's happening across Europe. It's happening across the world. So we can't really complain about that. We've all been through tough economic times. It's cyclical. When you've got tough economic times, you just keep putting one foot in front of the other, and eventually it lifts and things start feeling a bit better. But the problem for South Africans, which is what's made South Africans' life so much harder this year, is that on top of all of that, they then had to put up with a whole lot of self-induced, or shall we say state-induced, own goals that hit us all roughly at the end of May. And I remember thinking recently, I feel better than I did at the middle of the year. Part of that is because it's summer, and I still maintain that our weather is one of the many things we take for granted in this country. But at the end of May, we found ourselves in a period of extreme load shedding for about 3 weeks. Now, we're going into winter, so people thought that was what the whole of winter was going to be like. Then we started hearing from the newspapers that it could go as high as 7, 8, 9, right up to 15. So people got worried about that. There was a lot of talk about a grid collapse. Okay, the whole system might go down. There was political uncertainty. It appeared that President Ramaphosa had lost interest in the job. There was talk of President Mashatile coming in. People didn't know a lot about Paul Mashatile. And then the Russian relationship was weird. We seemed to be going out on a tangent a bit in terms of embracing Vladimir Putin. We were telling the world that we were neutral when clearly we weren't. And the final straw was when the debacle happened around the Lady R boat, and foreign investors just said enough is enough. They smashed the rand, inflation went through the roof, interest rates went through the roof, and the national mood in this country went to the lowest level I think I've seen it in my entire political career. I've never heard the word immigration used as much as it was in the 2-3 months after that. But then I was thinking, why do I actually feel better? And then I went back and looked at the things. So we didn't actually wind up having extreme load shedding throughout winter. In fact, June was one of the lighter load shedding months. Now, I'm not being naive. I know we've got a 2 to 3 billion rand a month diesel habit that we're going to have to break. But I think as things get better, that will slowly evaporate. We didn't have a grid collapse, and last winter was the biggest threat. Next winter will be slightly easier as renewables come online, and 2025 should be quite a lot better. In terms of political uncertainty, President Ramaphosa has wind in his sails after the BRICS conference. It went well. Thank heavens Vladimir Putin didn't come. And Ramaphosa is excellent in that environment. So I think one can sort of shelve that political uncertainty for the moment, certainly at least until after elections. And in terms of the Russian relationship, I think that government learned a lesson. I think they saw quite quickly that we could lose 30% of our exports overnight, 20% to the European Union, 10% to the Americans, as a result of that relationship. Now, in South Africa, jobs are crucial. Load shedding has been devastating for jobs. COVID has been devastating for jobs. To lose 30% of our exports over something as silly as cozying up to Vladimir Putin just wasn't worth it. So you've seen a lot more government being on message, less Western bashing, a lot more engaging with our big trading partners, to the point where the Americans and governments saying that the relationship is closer than it has been for a long time, etc. So I think we learned a valuable lesson, and hopefully we can park that whole Russian debacle to the side. So all of those factors have either improved or disappeared, or got than they were at the end of May, beginning of June. So that's why it feels a bit better.
And there's been a lot of
we still have lots of problems, but at least the ones that are all hitting us at the same time didn't all materialize.
It feels like we can get through those problems, whereas I think that the Russia, the US thing felt a bit of that. It felt, although it got serious problems, it felt even more serious.
Completely.
That 30% was scary. A lot of talk around. There's been a lot of talk around private sector getting involved. Eskom, whether it's sort of the private public partnerships. How much of that has impacted the sentiment? I mean, you're involved in 91, obviously a big business that is also gets involved in some of those discussions. What is the sentiment around business, private, and the public enterprises?
Look, I think this was all driven by a complete collapse in our state infrastructure, driven by, we all know the reasons. Cadre deployment, putting the wrong people into jobs that they weren't capable of doing, and then obviously massive corruption, leading to a point where a lot of our state-owned enterprises just weren't functioning. We had a situation where our rails weren't functioning. So as a result, people had to send things by road. Now, road costs 40% more. Our miners apparently would have exported about 150 billion rand more if our rail was working. It's not acceptable. We could have taxed that. We wouldn't have had the hole in our fiscus, or as big a hole in our fiscus this year. And apparently our growth would have been 5% higher than it is at the moment. So that's the bad news. Electricity, obviously, on top of that. Yeah. The good news is, though, that because we got ourselves into that state where our economy is literally on its knees because of it, government had to make some hard decisions. And that is letting the private sector in to get involved in working with the state-owned enterprises, and partial privatization of our rail, etc., our rail and our ports, because it's just not going to work unless that happens. So effectively what's going to happen is that you're going to have the miners will pull the stuff out of the ground using their own electricity, which they're busy building at the moment. They'll put it onto their own railway lines, on their own railway trucks, down to the ports, which would have been privatized, and the system will work. And that is our growth story on a sort of 2 to 4 year.
And just that change in mindset from the government to, a while ago shunning private sector, we can do it on our own, to now working together is huge.
They would love to shun the private sector, but I think they've gotten to a point where actually if the private sector doesn't come in, the whole thing's going to collapse.
And that's quite a nice feeling.
They realise that
we're there.
So it's a sort of begrudgingly letting them in, but I think they're going to have to let them in. And it seems to be working behind the scenes.
You mentioned Eskom. I mean, we can't talk about SA without talking about Eskom. So the partnership, or there's been a lot of capacity brought online by the private sector. There's also been the number around when load shedding is going to be over. I think at the beginning of the year it was 18 to 24 months. Yeah. There's a bit of a debate now between Eskom itself and our minister in terms of when it's going to be over. But what is the feeling out there in terms of, is that 18 to 24 months still realistic from this point?
Look, I think you can accept there's so much money and so much knowledge going into fixing the problem. Okay, I think you can accept that we're going to have another year of load shedding next year. But by this time next year, you should start feeling tangible benefits. Of course, there are constraints. The coal interests are fighting back, but they've had it too good for too long, but they're not going to be able to hold back against the wave that is renewables. There's a shortage of grid capacity, but that is going to expand over time. The private sector are working in terms of making sure that we expand that. And there's apparently enough grid capacity to lift us from where we are at the moment, which obviously is this year was rock bottom. So I think you'll start feeling tangible benefits final quarter of next year, and they say that 2025 should feel quite a lot better. And can you imagine if we can make things feel quite a lot better, and then into sort of end of 25, 26, have it almost fixed. Can you imagine how much better that would help with confidence in this country?
No, I mean, that's massive. And maybe we just need another Rugby World Cup to cut load shedding. So it's quite funny how during that there was no load shedding, which was quite interesting.
Well, we can do that. That's why we've been burning all the diesel. That's why I think we've spent sort of 24 of our billion of our 29 billion for the year, and the year only ends at the end of March. So that's why we've seen a bit of extreme load shedding recently.
Another big event coming up in South Africa is elections. You mentioned it earlier. This time does feel a little bit different, where it feels like the accountability of the ruling party is maybe going to catch up with it for the first time in our new democracy. What's the feeling out there in terms of where the ANC sits, the polls at the moment? And then the second part of that question is, how do coalitions work? What are the possible outcomes?
Look, I think elections next year could be quite exciting. As you say, for the first time, it looks as though we might have a challenged result. It's interesting. For a long time, the analysts have been saying that the ANC will get between 45 and 52%. Now, if they got between 45 and 50, if they get above 50%, then no need for any coalitions. And then the status quo continues, but at least the whole cleanup of the state-owned enterprises, etc., continues as well, because we don't want that to be derailed. Business getting involved, partial privatization, etc. If they get 45 to 50%, then they'll go with one of the smaller parties. Shouldn't make too much of a difference. And the analysts were saying highly unlikely that they get the 40% that was coming out of polls in the middle of the year. Highly unlikely that they wind up in a coalition with the DA, which would be very good for the economy, very good for the country. Also, apparently, the least likely scenario is that they wind up in a national coalition with the EFF, which would be very bad for the economy and for the country. But recently, the analysts have started saying, well, hold on a second. The new registration drive is going better than expected. That's it. That's going to benefit the opposition parties, apparently. And also the ANC are struggling with funding because corporate South Africa is not donating what it did back in 2017 because they've lost faith in the president. So the ANC is struggling with funding, and that could also affect their potential next year, in which case they could. So quite a few of the analysts are starting to say they might actually take the ANC's level down from 45 lower towards 40%, and then suddenly it becomes game on. Could anyone take it? I mean, from the multi-party coalition perspective, they certainly think that they can. They think it's going to be very close. The analysts see them somewhere around 36% max, but at a regional level, then it gets quite interesting because the multi-party coalition could take KZN, possibly Gauteng. So then it gets quite interesting.
Yeah, so I suppose a lot to look forward to, but as you mentioned,
it could be exciting.
Yeah, it could be a very good outcome. Okay, so silver lining time. We spoke last week. There are some factors that could change both globally and locally. I think you've touched on Eskom, you've touched on some of those locally. But what are some of the things or possible scenarios you could see for South Africa and sort of next year, 3-4 years out?
So I think certainly, unless the conflict in the Middle East expands or accelerates from here, then you should see over the next year to 18 months a more positive global backdrop. The first quarter of next year will remain under pressure because interest rates are going to stay high and growth is under pressure. All right, so the first quarter of next year will probably be more of the same, but then they should start coming down in the developed world by the end of March, end of April. The minute markets know when interest rates are going to start coming down in America, immediately the dollar will soften. It's happening already. Emerging and risk on starts coming back on. You can already feel it coming back on. We sort of have one risk on day a week and we go, oh, that feels nice. Suddenly our markets strengthen a bit, our currency strengthens, but there's more of that to come. Emerging markets start coming back in vogue, which will include South Africa. So a more positive global environment. That feeds through into South Africa and makes us feel better in terms of sentiment, in terms of the currency, in terms of flows. Add on top of that our rail starting so that's the 1 year story. It's more positive global environment helps us, and then add on top of that state-owned infrastructure over the next 2, 3, 4 years starting to at least work. I'm not saying fixed, but at least become functional, then there's a great growth story there as well. So you've got better global environment, plus fixing our state-owned infrastructure, getting growth going. You should see a better 3-4 years going forward.
I think that's as we said in the beginning, the change a year ago today is certainly more positive, but something we tell our clients all the time is that it's still going to be a bumpy ride.
Oh yeah,
we're speaking about opportunities.
South Africa will always be bumpy, but it shouldn't be as bumpy as we've had it.
So we are used to bumpy rides, just as you said, maybe less bumpy for the shorter term.
Just merely interest rates coming down. I mean, they went up and up and up like a roller coaster over the last 18 months. That throttles economies, it throttles household budgets, etc. When they start coming down, it's like a massive release of all that throttled air, and everything starts feeling a little bit better.
All right, thanks, Jeremy. I think that was great. I had a great sort of a recap. So I think from a recap of what we discussed, things are feeling a little bit easier. You could see a softening of, I suppose, Eskom interest rates in SA, and also global outlook looks more positive, you know. Take it with a pinch of salt, and it could be a bumpy ride, but thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's been great discussing it, and hopefully everyone enjoyed the market wrap. And yeah, we'll see you in 2024. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.